Order. Bob Seeley to move the motion.
Under your chairmanship, Ms. Rees, I'm here to argue for to look at government policy on China, but also to argue in part for a more coherent version of it, notwithstanding the very considerable progress that, to be fair to government, it has been making. I want to start by outlining a few ideas. I think for me, the 21st century is going to be one that marks a struggle between two visions for humanity, between open and closed societies, between states that are the servants of their people or states that are the masters of their people, and whether the great scientific discoveries of this century, artificial intelligence, big data, are going to be used to help humanity or to enslave it. Opposing the policies of the Chinese Communist Party and sadly the direction that they've embarked on for the last 10 to 15 years does not mean being anti-Chinese. Many Chinese oppose the Chinese Communist Party, as indeed we know that many tens of thousands of brave Hong Kong activists do in our own country. I'm delighted to see, as I said, the Deputy Foreign Secretary here to answer on behalf of government. And I fully accept that the relationship that we have is significantly more complex than the relationship that we had with the USSR. We have a much deeper trading relationship with communist China. We need to work together on climate and the environment, although that should not be used as an excuse for the status quo. China presents a need for a more complex set of alliances, for a more complex containment. But there is a greater urgency because in many ways China's power is more powerful than that of the Soviet Union. And we need, I think, to change the dynamic. But it is quite clear that shutting off the global economy that the West still heavily influences but no longer controls is not an option. But for me, the direction of travel is clear. And just this week, what have we had? Chinese vessels daily encroach in Taiwanese territorial waters with conventional military tensions increasing. Just this week in the UK, the head of GCHQ warns that China represents a growing and genuine threat not only to the UK but to the internet as a whole. 3 men, including border guards, are arrested on spying charges, and the US announces that it will raise the tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to 100%, citing unfair practices. So we are in the middle of, I think, what the government calls an epoch-defining challenge. Some people on this side of the House, and maybe indeed on others, see it as a more significantly adversarial relationship. And I accept that there are elements of both, and then just to focus on words to define this issue, be it adversarial, be it enemy, be it challenge, is not necessarily the most helpful. But what is important is that our policies become less piecemeal. And I don't want to underestimate the journey that the government has been on. Much has changed since the failed golden era. And it's clear that the hope that the UK, that the US and other partners had, that normalising trade relations with China would lead to greater security on all sides, has not materialised. Indeed, quite the opposite. What China and arguably Russia have done is to trash the system from the inside. But I do think that our policies, with respect, are still a little bit too piecemeal. And although we've had sensible decisions on Huawei, spurred by myself, the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green and others, and we've had the passing of the National Security Act, and we've had a significant number of measures, I still think we need to go further. I'm looking at trying to develop a coherent set of ideas, not only in this speech, but with the Civitas think tank, and I hope we're publishing stuff next month. And I also want to pay tribute and thank people such as Charlie Parton, who's the former diplomat, who's done a lot of really good work advising members of Parliament on both sides of the House on China strategy, highlighting some of what the Chinese Communist Party has been saying to itself about the West, but also Ben Rogers at Hong Kong Watch and others, and Luke Pulford at IPAC for the work that they have all done.
And I thank the Honourable Member for securing the debate. Given the arrest this week and the issues outlined by the Honourable Member, does he agree it's an issue of pace of assessing the situation and the need for that cross-government audit of the attempts of the Chinese Communist Party to influence UK politicians and government and individuals operating in the UK, as we've seen in the arrests this week, who were attempting to intimidate and harass Hong Kong democracy activists?
I agree very much with the point that he's making, and I think that we do need to increase our pace, and that is one of the things that I would like to argue here. China's it's no secret what the Chinese Communist Party wants. It does not want to live in harmony with the West, but to dominate it. Western nations are viewed by the CCP in CCP literature as hostile foreign forces intent on damaging Beijing. So in document number 9, for example, the CCP describes democracy as one of 9 false ideological trends. That full list includes promoting Western constitutional democracy, promoting universal values, which would attempt to weaken the theoretical foundations of the party's leadership, promoting civil society to dismantle the ruling party's social foundations, promoting neoliberalism, which would challenge China's basic economic system, promoting the Western ideal of free journalism, which would challenge the Communist Party's grip on power, promoting historical nihilism, i.e. a different interpretation of the Communist Party's history, and questioning the reform or questioning the socialist nature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. All these things are seen to be false historical trends. And there are many other documents that I won't go into here. But the challenges are happening, and I use the government word challenges, from this potentially adversarial state are happening on many, many fronts. So cyber. Just this week, we found that GCHQ has said that there is an increased threat, and I was one of the, unfortunately, servicemen and women who found their details to be potentially not as secure as we would have liked, I think, last week when we were told that our details had been stolen or potentially vulnerable to theft. Trade dumping, an absolutely critical element of this. China's developing nation status at the WTO means that the rules on dumping do not apply to it. And my worry is that because we are slow off the mark here, and the Americans have put a 100% tariff on electric vehicles, the European Union may follow suit, we are going to be a dumping ground for Chinese goods. This is not an accident. The destruction of our own industries is not because the Chinese are necessarily good at this, although some are. And in a free state, arguably more would be. But it is a deliberate state policy. IP theft from happening now, but also happening 10, 20 years ago. Long-term planning to buy up resources. Super cheap communist state loans. Of overproduction as a matter of policy. And dumping goods on international markets to bankrupt Western firms as well. Huawei was an instructional lesson of this. Originally partnered with Canadian Nortel, who found their intellectual property suddenly in Beijing. Nortel then collapsed. Huawei then took its place, and Huawei's agenda, state agenda, was to undercut Western firms and dominate the 5G market. It is this creation of dependence which is one of the things which is most dangerous, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes' time. Transnational repression, the spying and intimidation of their own people abroad, but also Hong Kong activists, a growing problem, which we seem reluctant to robustly tackle. Questioning of COVID and its origins. If COVID had come out of a laboratory in France or the United Kingdom or the United States especially, we would never have heard the end of it from political parties in this country or the media. And yet I am staggered by the level of disinterest shown about the likelihood that COVID came out of the Wuhan virus laboratory. And I'm also staggered at the disinterest of whether actually it had been genetically altered before it was presumably accidentally leaked. And if nothing else, and I think Lord Ridley in the other house, he said the UK security and scientific establishment refused to look at the evidence for a lab leak. An extraordinary claim from somebody who is a very considerable expert on this. And if nothing else, it is astonishing that we seem to be so disinterested in biosecurity standards in other countries, given the potential hazard, not only to ourselves, but to humanity. Next, the malign influence of the United Front, which we have potentially seen in Parliament. The United Front is a long-term, whole-of-state strategy of the Chinese Communist Party to be used to further the interests of the CCP within and outside China through multiple organs of the Chinese state, through a range of activities, overt and covert, legal and illegal. So it encompasses not only espionage, but also forms of sometimes overt, but sometimes covert, malign influence, whereby, and we know from our own Security Committee, that the United Front has achieved, quotes, low-level penetration of access across most sectors of UK business and civil society. And I'm just wondering what the Deputy Foreign Secretary has to say about that, and whether he is concerned about that penetration across most sectors of UK business and civil society by the United Front. Next, the domination of DNA research. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just on this, and also cellular modules, because they are so little known, but potentially so important. China believes its own biomedical data is a, quotes, foundation strategic state resource. And yet at the same time, it is hoovering up DNA and genomic data from around the world. Western security officials, including those identified in the IEC report, see DNA biotech as another major concern. And indeed, the Pentagon, the United States, listed BGI, otherwise known as the Beijing Genomics Institute, as a Chinese military company, and the US government has twice blacklisted the group's subsidiaries for their role in the collection and analysis of DNA that has enabled China's repression of its own ethnic minorities. I mean, that is a really creepy and unpleasant policy that the CCP and the BGI have been accused of, to collect DNA research for the repression of their own minorities. Needless to say, not only have we not done the same thing, but BGI Tech Solutions was actually awarded a £10.8 million contract in this country for genomic testing of COVID samples. And not only that, but in 2021, Reuters revealed that the company was selling prenatal tests to millions of women globally in order to collect their DNA data using biotech methods developed with the Chinese military. A US top counterintelligence official from the US government has said that BGI is little different from Huawei, a legitimate business that is also masking intelligence gathering for nefarious purposes. And I do wonder if we are, again, sleepwalking dangerously and somewhat naively into another ethical crisis of the kind that we had with Huawei, we are now seeing with BGI. And can I ask the Minister, and I haven't had time to show the Minister the speech because I only finished it about half an hour before the debate, so I would happily write to him on it, and perhaps he could give me a written answer to what the government is planning to do when it comes to genomic research and protecting the United Kingdom, not only our DNA data, unless he thinks we can be sharing it with the rest of the world. Maybe we should be, maybe we could be, but also what we think BGI and China is trying to do with our DNA. Next, I want to talk a little bit about cellular modules, because again, it is one of these obscure but really important topics. The Internet of Things, Internet devices that talk to each other, from alarm systems to video recorders to fridges to aeroplanes to boats, maybe to nuclear weapon system launching programs one day, even to the lights in our living room. These gadgets rely on modules that connect the equipment to the Internet and talk to each other. And these are groups of chips grouped together into modules. China supplies the West with more than 60% of these modules. But because they are updated remotely by the manufacturer, it is practically impossible to ensure that they are not spying on us and sending back data flows to their source. And if that sounds a bit paranoid, let's remember that TikTok is currently under investigation by the FBI after its parent company was using the app to monitor journalists in the United States. And let's also remember that allegedly a cellular module in a government car was compounded, or the car was pounded last year. Was it last year or a few months ago? I can't remember. Because it might have been pinging back eavesdrops conversations. China aims, just like Huawei, just like BGI, to dominate the market for cellular modules. Does the government have an opinion on whether that is a threat to our economy, to our people, and to our national security? I'm not even going to bother to touch on the military threat because it is a complex and detailed one. But my fear is not only the slow domination, and I think it was Sun Tzu, a great man, Sun Tzu, a philosopher of conflict, said the greatest battles are won, the greatest wars are won without battle. And that seems to be President Xi's aim. Arguably, it should also be our aim, and I think that idea should inspire us, that actually we need to defend ourselves now, and we need to take the short to medium and the long-term decisions to defend ourselves, not to wave aggressive fingers at people, but actually to be able to defend ourselves. And the reason I say that is the most dangerous outcome is that we become so dependent on China within the next 5 years, in everything from vehicles to fridges to cellular modules to our DNA, that when Taiwan is attacked, if we then take sanctions on China, we would effectively collapse the global economy, cause chaos in Europe and in our own country. You'll have a collapse of it'll make the energy crisis for the Ukraine war look like a picnic. And you'll have rioting in the streets, you'll have destabilized Western societies. Or we can stand by and say, fair enough. The other, potentially even greater threat, is that we break the alliance, which is undoubtedly China's strategic aim. We break the alliance between the United States and ourselves and the United States and Europe, which will be a catastrophe for Western civilization. So we actually need to be deepening our alliances with the US and Oz, but also with many other states in that part of the world, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. Finally, just on TikTok, in fact, okay, 2 more points. TikTok. For young people in China, the algorithm is different to that in the UK. In China, it's used to promote science, education, history of China. In our own countries, it makes citizens watch, quotes, stupid dance videos with the main goal of making us imbeciles. That's a statement from the US Air Force and Space Force's former chief software officer. So in China, TikTok is about entertaining education. Here, it is just about education. And not only is there cyber addiction is an issue, but also real addiction. Does the government have a position on the large-scale supply, illicit supply of fentanyl by China to the United States, which is now also becoming, if I understand, a problem in this country? So I'm going to wind up in the next 2 to 3 minutes. I said I was going to stick to 20 minutes, colleagues, and I'm trying to do that. Thank you. So what are we going to do about this? The real aim, the immediate policy, is to insulate ourselves. So in no particular order, some ideas. Let's add science to human rights. We can DNA where cotton comes from. Shouldn't we be mandating that in supply chains that go anywhere near China, we DNA cotton so we can see it comes from Xinjiang and it is made by slave labor, so we can outlaw it? This is an important thing to do for trade, for fair trade, to help jobs, not only in this country, but in Bangladesh and in India and places where they don't use slave labor. But it is also important for our human rights, and actually to take that human rights agenda consistently and to give it the respect that it needs. We need to diversify as a matter of urgency, as a national priority. We need to diversify our supply chains. So if there is war in the Pacific, if there is a war around Taiwan, we are not going to destroy our standard of living, our economy, or people's jobs in order to put sanctions on China or to support the United States or to support Taiwan. We need longer-term planning over rare earth minerals, something I haven't even brought up because of time considerations. We're beginning to act, but we are 2-3 decades behind China. Confucius centers. Tell them to stop spying on their citizens or shut them down and kick out the people in them. The same thing with Hong Kong economic officers, which are now also being used for intimidation of Chinese people in this country. Military, we need a permanent Western presence in disputed waters. We need more money spent. WTO and dumping. We need to work together. We need to treat China as a developed economy, even if in WTO terms it is not. I'd also suggest we need to have faith in ourselves as well. There is no inevitability about China's victory and future. It is a very powerful country, but like Russia, it lacks few actual friends. In fact, its one formal alliance is with the basket case of North Korea, although the basket case of Russia is also a pretty close ally. We have many friends and allies, and so does the United States, and so indeed do France. And we need to be working with those allies and with our partners in the Pacific for a new, subtle, but thoughtful and determined and robust containment programme. And that means spending on hard power, but it also means a much more assertive defence of our interests and understanding how decades of subversive conflict across culture, across business, sport and science can damage our national interests and threaten our people. Whether it's the use of artificial intelligence as well, big data, DNA sequencing, advanced propaganda techniques and modular and cellular modules. We need to do more to understand the modern world that we are inhabiting. We are in a battle for the future of humanity between democracies and authoritarian states. And at the moment, that conflict is being lost by us, and it is also being conducted in a myriad of subtle ways. And we need to grasp the extent of it, and we need to do more to react robustly to defend ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. May I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate, and also I'd be very grateful if members wouldn't refer to cases where charges have been brought, because as you know, that's sub judice. Thank you very much. Justin Matters.
Mr. Rees, it's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. Can I first of all congratulate the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight for securing this debate and for his excellent, wide-ranging opening remarks. I think he set out the challenges we face as a country, pretty dystopian vision of the future if we allow it to happen. I hope that we are able to collectively rise to the challenges that he's laid out. There was a number of matters he raised which I will touch on as well. But I'll start with the refreshed integrated review published by the government last year, which stated that China poses an epoch-defining and systemic challenge with implications for almost every area of government policy and the everyday lives of British people. I consider that to be a welcome revision to our approach. It's a pretty serious, broad statement of where we are and what we need to do. We do need to recognise China's size and influence alongside the risks that it brings, and I think that the point that's been made very eloquently by the Honourable Member for Isle of Wight, that the reliance that we may have and do have is one of those risks, alongside its greater aggression, its human rights record, and the strengthening of its partnership with Russia are all, I think, potentially existential threats. In many ways, the news emerging this week on both sides of the Atlantic is a stark reminder that these challenges are here and now, and that care needs to be taken. And I will take one very clear example from my own constituency, which I think feeds into the wider picture that has been painted today. My constituency has a Stellantis plant in it, and they announced yesterday that they will be selling Chinese-made electric vehicles from the autumn in Europe and in the UK from next year. Now, we have a very proud history of manufacturing in this country, and indeed in Ellesmere Port at the what's known commonly as the Vauxhall motor plant. That's now owned by Stellantis, and a lot of work was put in to secure the investment we needed to move to electric vehicle production. That's very important for the plant, for the constituency, indeed for the whole UK automotive sector. And I had hoped that we could lead the way in the sale of new electric vehicles, as the plan was always to expand from where we are now, which is production of vans, into the domestic car market. So it is a concern that the owners are already turning to cheaper Chinese electric vehicles too. And it's too soon to understand what the impact of that will be on domestic production, but surely, Mr. Rees, it's not going to help it. And that's not to say I want to insulate the UK from competition, but there has to be fair competition, and there has to be one eye on the future. There is no doubt that the move to an all-electric vehicle country is going to be expensive, and we should be looking at how we keep costs down. But if major manufacturers are already concluding that the best way for them to meet that challenge is to turn to Chinese imports, then we are never going to have the domestic manufacturing capacity to meet domestic demand, never mind continue to be the proud exporter to the rest of the world that we have always been. So I note that yesterday, as we've already heard, President Biden announced he was introducing a 100% tariff on electric vehicles made in China, as well as tariffs on lithium batteries, critical minerals and semiconductors. And that is a move designed to prevent cheap subsidised Chinese goods entering the US market. That decision was taken after a 4-year-long review. And there are similar moves across the EU to assess the impact of Chinese imports. Since October, they've been investigating whether local subsidies have been helping Chinese car manufacturers undercut European-made vehicles. The investigation is due to be reporting very shortly, but I'm not aware of any similar review being undertaken here. It was reported in February that the government were contemplating commissioning the Trades Remedy Authority to undertake an investigation into subsidies, but 3 months on we have silence. I wonder if the Minister is able to confirm whether the government are still looking into this and whether they will be looking at what the EU say if they do indeed find there is conclusive evidence of subsidies. So I think that we risk putting ourselves in a very exposed position. Our manufacturing capacity will be reduced, probably permanently, and we will be kidding ourselves about the race to net zero if it is reliant on Chinese imports. But cars is just one example of our potential exposure. Steel, energy, fibre optics, semiconductors, rare elements, or any other number of parts of our infrastructure are part of this discussion. We cannot allow ourselves to be at the mercy of one country, especially not one like China, who I think have what I would consider to be a ruthless focus on economic dominance, which, as we've heard from the Honourable Member, is going to lead us into potentially a very dark place indeed. Now, clearly, we do benefit from Chinese investment in this country, and I think life sciences is one of those sectors where they're particularly heavily investing in. I think after what the Honourable Member said, that needs to be looked at very carefully as well. But the fact is you can go down any street in this country and you will see things that have Chinese ownership. Pubs, shops, restaurants, cinemas. That's, I think, probably fair enough in a global economy that they've got those investments. But what about water companies, energy companies, nuclear power plants? I do wonder how we've managed to get to the point where our critical infrastructure is so open to influence by Chinese investors. How have we got to the point where China is a part owner in Thames Water and has significant debts to at least 2 Chinese state-owned banks? I think we can all see where that might lead us if international tensions rise. And away from manufacturing, as the Honourable Member mentioned, the issues in cybersecurity have been well documented, and indeed there was a debate in here yesterday on the dangers of social media, and I absolutely agree with what the Honourable Member said about the differences between TikTok and its Chinese equivalent, Douyin, and certainly from a child's perspective, in China it certainly has a lot more educational content. Indeed, in 2021, the Chinese government enacted a law which called for the creation and broadcast of online content conducive to the healthy growth of minors. That can, of course, be seen as part of the wider attitude towards free speech in China, but it is, I think, of interest that they obviously see some of the content on these channels may be of detrimental effect on a child's development, but they're more than happy for this stuff to be pumped into our own children's screens. Yeah.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. When he says they talk about the Chinese government, does he welcome the distinction that the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight made at the start of the debate between the government of China and its people? And as someone who lived in China for 2 years, can I make a personal statement that 我非常喜欢中国，还我非常喜欢中国人，没我不喜欢中国的中国人, which, for those who don't know any Mandarin, I appreciate mine is rusty, translates as I like the country, I like the people. It's the government who have caused the concerns that are the focus of the debate today. It's the politicians and the political leadership of China that is the challenge.
Justin Matters.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think he makes a very important point, the bits of it that I actually understood. And I was actually, he must have seen my speech, because I am actually about to make the very important distinction. Not in Mandarin, no, in English, I'm afraid. There is a very important distinction, Ms Rees, which I think we would all make here between the Chinese people and the CCP. And I think that there's no doubt that the CCP are the malign influence in all this. But just turning back to the question of social media, I think there is a concern that there may be an imbalance in terms of what we see in this country and what is seen in China, and there may be deliberate reasons for that. But certainly we should be looking not just at that, but also about the dangerous anti-Western conspiracy theory, democracy undermining stuff that comes out from all around the world, but also in particular from China. And I do echo the comments made by the Director General of MI5 in 2022, when he conveyed the message that it would be wrong for us to cut ourselves off from 1/5 of the world's population, and we should continue to engage and work with China in a way that we can do so consistent with our own national security. But I don't think we have the balance right yet, and I think as the Honourable Member for Isle of Wight said, I think that balance is going to be consistently and constantly reviewed. We've got to have greater international resilience to international incidents than we have at the moment. I think the analogy with what happened in Russia is a very important one, because that is a real threat that we could be facing in the next few years, and we do not want to leave ourselves overexposed. And I think, as has been commented, many Western countries have begun now to understand the risks that we face, taking action against firms such as Huawei, and have limited the use of technologies in sensitive and critical infrastructure. But in this context, questions must now be raised about our reliance on the supply chains, which are controlled by China and have such a huge impact on our own infrastructure. It is clear that China holds a dominant position over global supply chains, critical to the net zero transition. They control significant proportions of the rare metals that are necessary for lithium-ion batteries, wind turbines and solar PV modules. In lithium-ion battery chains, for example, China are responsible for 80% of the supplies of spherical graphite and refined manganese, and of anodes and electrolytes. That is something that clearly needs a coordinated response. And it does feel, in conclusion, Mr. Rees, that we are at a very important point in global politics. We must seek to work across the globe to deal with the many challenges that the planet faces, whilst at the same time protecting our national security and our long-term economic interests. Taking a cautious and proactive approach to risks is central to protecting our country and its citizens. I believe the way we approach China is going to be a central feature of our lives for many years to come. And on every occasion we deal with them, the question of security, economic or otherwise, must be the very first thing that we ask.
Thank you. Before I call Mark Logan, I'd just like to ask members if they could speak for 8-9 minutes, and then we'll get everyone in. Mark Logan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And unlike my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight today, I haven't prepared a very thorough speech, but I'm glad that the honourable member has brought this important topic to the floor here in Westminster Hall. Also, 我首先说，Bermondsey 的议员朋友，你这个中国话说得非常好。So the member for Bermondsey, I'm not sure how you say that in Chinese, but the member is probably Bermondsey or something. But I think he speaks fantastic Mandarin Chinese, and actually is a living manifestation of what our aspirations should be for the country, to have more people studying Mandarin Chinese. I know it's something that was in the integrated review and we've talked about for years on end, but we do need more diplomats in the Foreign Office. We need more people across the whole of Whitehall who can, not only speak Mandarin Chinese, engage with China, but have as many experts in the past have talked about, the +1. So no matter what field that you're working in these days, whether you're a biological scientist of some sort, or you're an accountant, or you're a government official, is that you should always have that as the substantive part which you own, and then the Chinese understanding is the kind of icing on the cake. I don't want today to step on the toes of the Deputy Foreign Secretary, but I did feel, as I was listening to colleagues talk through a number of points, I will try to come on to some of those and some of my own thoughts in response, having been based in the People's Republic of China for about 13 years, and I worked in the Foreign Office. I was based in Shanghai, and I've studied China for about 20 years, and I know less about it today than I did 20 years ago. But I will try my best. The thing that strikes me with a lot of these debates, and my honourable friend in the Isle of Wight will be very perceptive of this, and I felt over the last 4.5 years, is that I worry sometimes about the overall tone or the mood on the debate when it comes to China, because it feels like, whether we're sat in the United Kingdom or the United States or in the West, that it's completely driven by fear, and it's completely driven by that sense of threat. And that makes me a little worried in that it sort of strikes as being us reticent. We don't have confidence in what we have to offer ideologically. We don't have confidence in our own system because implicitly, in the 1980s, we didn't really care about China because it wasn't competition for us. But today we care about it. We talk about it every day in every single debate, which unfortunately maybe gives a signal to others in the world, or indeed to China, that perhaps they do have the upper hand when it comes to many different forms of engagement, whether it's business, commercial, political, diplomatic, amongst other things. So I think that soul-searching part is incredibly important for us, because it shouldn't just be about asking what is our China policy or our China strategy, but rather it's about the UK, what's our identity, what's our place in the world, what's our priorities, and then having everything else flow from that. Because China, at the end of the day, it's just one country of 200. It's a very important country. It's a United Nations Security Council member. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It's a population of 1.4 billion, and it had great GDP growth rates in the double figures for many number of years. I'm sure when the Honourable Member for Bermondsey was based there and I was based there, we were experiencing the 13–14% GDP growth rates every year, and that has ended. China is also in a very different economic climate now, especially over the last couple of years. A question I often ask myself is that it's not what's our China policy, but indeed what does the Chinese think of us? I mean, what's China's UK strategy? What's China's UK policy? And I'm never really sure the answer to that. And I'm conscious of different friends in our audience today as well that have been long-time China watchers. But I always felt for years being based there, even working in diplomacy, even coming into contact with party secretaries and mayors and those from the Politburo from time to time, that to this day it still feels like the invisible hand. So I'm always perplexed when people speak with great authority about the Communist Party of China, because it's just so invisible. So I often wonder where that intel and knowledge comes from in relation to the CPC. The other thing is, in some of the points that were raised, I think what can be really difficult, and we don't want to play into China's political rhetoric when it comes to this, but we often talk about the disaggregation between the people of China and the Communist Party of China. And I know this stat has been overly used over the last number of years, but there's a certain amount of truth in it. When the Ash Center in Harvard in 2020 did the research on the levels of approval ratings for the Communist Party of China, or indeed the central government in China, the approval ratings were sitting at about 95% amongst the research he did. And I know everyone will come back and say that can't be true, but my feeling, my sense being there for over a decade, was that very rarely did people complain about the national leadership. Usually it was complaints about local government, village level, or indeed in municipal levels, provincial level, but rarely was there complaints against the national government. And I think it would be interesting to see an updated poll on that, because obviously that was in 2020, probably just before COVID struck, and China's had a lot more difficulties politically and economically, and especially in the last couple of years. So I'd be very interested to see polling on that also. I think something that the Prime Minister on Monday, whenever we were at the policy exchange for the speech, it was an incredibly interesting speech, and something that struck me was these ideas around securitisation and potentially entering into a world of the next 5 to 10 years, which is more dangerous than the world that we've lived in recent decades. And the one thing, again, is a slight concern from my end, not necessarily vis-a-vis the Prime Minister, but something I'd written in the South China Morning Post about 3 years ago was on this idea of liberalisation, or ideas of liberalism in the international system. Often talked about how, with economic engagement, that China would become more like the West, and it seems that we've given up on that for the most part in recent years. But my contention is, and this is very provocative, but I ask this every single time in this kind of debate, is it China becoming more like the West, or is the West starting to copy things from China's handbook when it comes to banning things? Or I know those linked to the policy exchange think tank were very clear, intent on banning TikTok within the United Kingdom. Again, my worry is that it's driven by fear, it's driven by this idea of threat, but I will give way in a second. What I think is more important than politics and regulation is being innovative. It's saying to us, ourselves in the UK, can we come up with a company which can outstrip the American tech companies, which can do better than TikTok has done, or will we become like the European Union and just think we can regulate our way into a successful future? And I don't think that that's possible. And I think the Chancellor, in a recent statement that he's made, he's very keen that we have a British Microsoft, and I absolutely agree with that sentiment and that positivity that he's trying to put out. And I will give away to the member for Isle of Wight.
With the issue about fear, I think it's actually about understanding and not about fear. But just on the TikTok issue alone, he's saying always about fear of TikTok. Do you think actually it's about TikTok having one set of values for Chinese kids and another set of values for everything else? And actually it's got nothing to do with fear, but it's got something to do with protecting children.
Thank you. And so I'm not here to defend TikTok. I do use TikTok, as do many of our colleagues, indeed some high-profile ministers in the cabinets. And that's not what it's about. But I think that some of this has got to do with education as well, and looking to the right honourable friend on this side of the House. Because again, when I was based in China, I have a daughter that's in the education system, going into primary school level at China, and there's a lot in the education system which is very focused on the harder aspects of education and learning sciences and mathematics and physics. And I think that can be reflected in the social media that's used there, and by the case of Douyin, please.
Not to discuss mutual family, we have it still living in the People's Republic of China. But on his point about polling, perhaps he could focus in a little on what the punishment might be for suggesting you are dissatisfied with where the Chinese government is at, and also around the corruption and local level issues. But fundamentally, and a much more important issue for us here, where we still have a responsibility, is polling within Hong Kong specifically, and the government's responsibilities towards Hong Kong nationals and those seeking British national overseas status, and whether we might see further measures to support those people in the face of Article 23 extensions of the diminution of rights in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I think the honourable member for Bermondsey, it's a fantastic point you've raised explicitly on Hong Kong, because I do feel that it's very unfortunate what's happened in Hong Kong in recent years. I actually personally think it's a strategic mistake in terms of the governance of there. So that's something I do hope that the Deputy Foreign Secretary comes on to. I'm going to finish now as well, Madam Chair, just by saying, I think for us, again, it's the whole idea of soul searching, and it's asking, again, what's the UK's role in the world, and how can we, I think, slightly push back against the tone slightly, because we don't want to push China into the arms of, as we've talked about, the axis of authoritarian regimes, because there's many things in which Chinese people care about, which their values are very similar to our own values. It's not just the paranoia of 200,000 Chinese students in the UK and they're all doing these bad things. Actually, it shows a society that's striving to do better, and that's values that we share and hold dearly within this country as well. And on that, I will finish. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the Mandarin, but we're supposed to use English in debates, as you know. And if I lapse into Welsh, please forgive me now. Okay. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Ms Chair, that you will find no attempt at Mandarin Welsh or anything else, for that matter, during my remarks here this afternoon. Can I congratulate my good friend, and he is a friend who I was privileged to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee with, the member for the Isle of Wight, for securing this debate. And I guess the only thing wrong is that we don't have longer, or indeed more, members taking part, because you wouldn't know it from the acres of empty green seats that surround us, Ms Rees, that this is the defining challenge of our time, and it's too often, I believe, thought of as a complicated, faraway foreign policy issue, when in actual fact the challenge of China is where domestic and foreign policy are so intertwined. This is an issue of foreign policy, this is an issue of domestic policy that manifests itself in many different policy areas and is of concern to people right up and down the UK, whether that's in places like Glasgow, Kilmarnock, Edinburgh, Cardiff, London, the Isle of Wight, or wherever. It is indeed a domestic issue as much as it is a foreign policy issue. The nature of the challenge that China presents manifests itself right across a whole sphere of policy areas, many of which have been touched upon. It's an economic challenge, it's a security challenge, it's a technology challenge, it's a challenge to our democratic values, our open society and way of life, it's a challenge to our energy security, a challenge to our national resilience. But we would be wrong, I believe, and I think this is what the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight touched upon when he described too much of the government's approach as piecemeal. We would be wrong to try and compartmentalise any kind of response to that challenge into individual policy areas. It's so complex that I actually don't believe the challenge China presents us with can ever really be won or lost. Indeed, it just needs to be constantly revisited. I mean, can you imagine having the debate that we're having today, notwithstanding the honourable gentleman who spoke before me, can you imagine having this debate 12 to 15 years ago at the height of the so-called golden era of relations? I rather think not. So China will constantly evolve and produce new challenges, yes, of course, new opportunities, and a whole series of contradictions in between. And the pace of change that we've seen since the golden era speaks to that. I want to do something that members might expect me to do, which is the Scotland bit of this debate, indeed the devolution bit of this debate, and it's good to have a Welsh Member of Parliament sitting in the chair who I'm sure will well understand some of these remarks. Devolution is well understood in Beijing, probably better understood than it is by most members of this House. And my goodness, do they have a strategy to deal with the fact that huge swathes of financial and legislative power doesn't sit here in London, but sits in Edinburgh, it sits in Cardiff, it sits in Belfast. But does the UK government, or indeed any of the devolved governments, have a strategy to deal with that? No, none of them do. Absolutely none of them do. There are three areas I want to focus on in the short time I have, the three E's: exports, education, and energy. And as far as Scotland is concerned, if we're going to do the good bit first, it's on exports. Exports from Scotland to China stand at about £800 million. Exact same as our exports to Norway, exact same as our exports to Singapore. A relatively healthy position for Scotland to be in. Those are the 2023 figures. The same year as the Integrated Review, where China is written up as an epoch-defining challenge, and the same year as the major speech by the Commission President, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, when she called on countries to de-risk their exports with China. I would argue Scotland is already very much in that place, has a healthy level of exports. But when it comes to education, when it comes to energy, there is a massive risk surface that no government of any stripe should be content with. The risk in Scottish universities, as far as dependency on Chinese funding is concerned, is far higher than anywhere else in the UK. And bear in mind, I say to all members, education is entirely devolved. There is no minister across the road that can do a single thing about education policy in Scotland. It's entirely devolved. But we have a situation where, for example, the University of Glasgow, 42% of its fee income comes from students from China. Now, that would be a problem, Ms. Rees, if 42% of the income came from students in France. But of course, we're dealing with a very different issue in China. And that's not to say that Chinese students aren't welcome to the University of Glasgow or universities anywhere else across the UK. They absolutely are. But why have we allowed these fine institutions of higher education to create these massive surfaces of risk that would not stand the test of any kind of geopolitical shock, for example, in the Strait of Taiwan? In February of this year, the Scottish Government produced its international education strategy, and it says, quote, it wishes to diversify the international student population. So there is at least an understanding that there is an issue, that there is a problem. What there isn't, I'm sorry to say, is a strategy to turn that around. There isn't a strategy working with higher education institutes, industry and others to globalise the student population, the international student population that exists in Scotland. If we look also at research funding, £12 million in research funding has flown into UK universities that come from bodies that have links to, for example, the repression of Uyghurs, espionage, cyber hacking and much else. The government knows about this problem, Ms Rees, but it daren't speak about it, never mind have a strategy to deal with it. And then there's energy. The Deputy Secretary will, I'm sure, know about my recent problems, for example, with Ming Yang Smart Energy building the largest European turbine manufacturing project in Scotland. How on earth is it in the UK or Scotland's interest to put into the hands of an entity from a hostile foreign power such a critical part of our national energy infrastructure? Just weeks after the Norwegian government declined the same entity, and in the same month that the European Commission has started its antitrust investigation into unfair competition practices by Chinese turbine manufacturers. To summarise very briefly, the point I want to make to the Deputy Secretary this afternoon is devolution is a backdoor for hostile foreign states, and that is well understood in the Chinese consulate in Edinburgh, Cardiff and in Belfast. I'm not looking for ministers in London to override anybody in the other capitals of the UK. What I want is a joined-up strategy between devolved government and state-level government to help us de-risk key parts of our economy, key parts of our infrastructure, and ensure that we aren't overly dependent on a hostile foreign power that is hostile to our own values, our own way of life, and certainly doesn't have our own national interests as far as energy security, education, or much else are concerned. So my appeal to the Secretary is to understand this, to work with ministers in Edinburgh and elsewhere to start to unpick these dependencies, diversify our institutions, and ensure that the risk is being driven down. Thank you.
Spokespersons and the Minister at 3:28. So, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate. Can I first of all thank the Honourable Gentleman for Isle of Wight for bringing this forward. The Honourable Gentleman from Bolton referred to, I have to say it, he referred to it'd be great if China became more westernised. My goodness, I'm going to explain why they're not more westernised and why China does not fit into that category and never will. Their human rights abuses and their persecution of those with religious views is enormous, and I'm going to categorise those in the very short time that I have to make a comment. The countless human rights violations committed by China restrict religious freedom for Tibetan Buddhists are especially concerning to me. I continue to raise my voice towards those issues. My efforts to call out China for its deplorable actions and threaten the basic rights of those within its borders and across the world have led the Chinese Communist Party to sanction me, as has sanctioned others. This the country that the Honourable Gentleman from Bolton says could become more westernised. Well, I'll tell you what, start thinking like we in the Western world, where we understand human rights, we understand the right of religious belief, we understand the right to be friends of others and not to suppress people. That's what our values, our British values are, and the Minister will respond to that. So no threats will deter me or others from speaking up about the human rights in China and elsewhere. Current relationship between China and the UK is a precarious state. Our government seeks to amend relations with China to increase trade and investment between two countries. I know the Minister will summarise some of those things, but we do and we need to collaborate on common goals, will be economic prosperity, global security and environmental protection. But China has to accept the issue of the right for us to have human rights and for people to have it. However, we must not allow our economic interests to overrule our moral obligation to protect the rule of law and human rights. It's widely recognised that China's aggressive actions violate the human rights of Uyghur Muslims, of Tibetan Buddhists, of Christians, of Falun Gong, and threaten the status of Hong Kong and Taiwan. Western country. My goodness, they have a long way to go to catch up, so they have. I must not know that those of us in the UK are not removed from the threat of Chinese influence. And the Prime Minister remarked that China poses a particular threat to our open and democratic way of life. Yeah, start listening to where the evidential base is. China's influence warrants our engagement with this growing power, but our security and that of our allies, along with the protection of human rights, must be cornerstones of our foreign policy on China. Recent threats to the status of Taiwan by China have significantly escalated tensions in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. The democracy and freedom of Taiwan are in danger from this, from China as well as the stability of the wider region. UK and Taiwan share a thriving £8 billion trade and investment relationship. So Taiwan's economy is vital for the success of the technology supply chain, which drives our global digital economy. Protecting Taiwan and our relationship with them is in the UK's and the world's economic interest, and it's very important. Hong Kong has experienced a severe escalation on people's freedoms imposed by China within the last decade. Earlier this year, a new security law took effect in Hong Kong, a law that severely restricts freedom of expression and other human rights of those in Hong Kong. We know that freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief are inextricably intertwined. While religious communities supposedly have the right to conduct religious activities in Hong Kong, we know that it will not be too long before freedom of religion or belief will fall with the rest of human rights in Hong Kong, as they have evidentially showed that they're not interested in being a Western power or even influenced by Western moral standards. Benedict Rogers, the CEO of Hong Kong, he's in here in the gallery today, whose work in promoting freedom in the country is quite commendable, remarked, and I quote, "Repression in Hong Kong would be dangerous to us all," and so it would be. China's activities extend far beyond the borders of Southeast Asia, of course. They have recently increased their influence in Africa and other parts of the world. I want to be very clear on this point. China suppresses human rights to such an extent that should China's influence continue to expand, the freedom and security of billions of people across this world would be in peril, and their human rights and their right to have a religious belief would be severely affected. Why is that? China has an insatiable appetite for anything else that anybody has. So when they're going across Africa, they're marking down where they can get the minerals, where they can have the influence, where they can take whatever that country has and use it. Occasionally ignoring actions by authorities and states for the sake of trade and investment will only lead to the escalation. It's indisputable that China regularly violates Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, one that China did sign. We must stand firm in our values and morals that guide our actions in creating a world where international law is upheld and human rights are protected. The current hostility and aggression of Chinese actions calls for us to stand together with greater courage, greater strength, greater determination to protect human rights and religious freedom. So whenever the Minister comes to summing up, and the two shadow ministers as well, I ask that the shadow ministers and our Minister and our government pay particular heed to China's violations of human rights and religious persecution, not only within its own borders, but indeed across all of the world as they consider their foreign policy on China. Thank you so much.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mrs. Rees, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair for this important and extremely timely debate on the UK Government's approach to China. And I'd like to thank, as everyone has, the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight for securing the debate, and for all those who have taken part in what has been a wide-ranging, well-informed and bilingual debate, which has highlighted many of the concerns. And there are many concerns that we have to consider, including China's Belt and Road Initiative, the well-documented mistreatment of religious and ethnic minorities, the use of the national security laws in Hong Kong, the future of Taiwan, Chinese multilateralism, particularly with the emergence of BRICS, the inherent dangers that we spoke about in the development of the Internet of Things, and the challenges domestically that we face with the CCP activities in monitoring their own people and also pro-democracy Hong Kong activists here in the UK. So there are many and varied concerns, and I hope that the Minister, in the time that he has, can address as many of them as possible. But it is not possible to address the problems and the challenges posed by China in one Westminster Hall debate, because we all recognise that in a relatively short time, China has become one of the most politically and economically powerful countries in the world. And the reality is there is now barely a country which either isn't in financial hock to China or is desperately trying to defend their own economic interests from China. So it's essential that when the UK government considers the future of the economic and political relationship it has with China, that it finds a way to ensure that securing trade and business links with Beijing does not come at the cost of our own obligation to defend international human rights, or that we compromise national security in pursuit of the yen. Ms Rees, the political and economic reach of China is quite astonishing. Beijing's phenomenally successful global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, has seen China invest in almost 150 countries, countries which take around 2/3 of the world's population and accounts for 40% of global GDP. Massive investment in linked by road, rail, sea and digital infrastructure have transformed the relationship of those participating nations have with Beijing, making them increasingly dependent on the Chinese economy and, as a result, building in both economic and political influence for China. Indebtedness, mainly among developing nations in the Global South who have accepted such investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, now stands at an eye-watering $1 trillion. And to quote Lord Alton of Liverpool, who said, "This has made them extraordinarily subservient and often into vassal states that do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party." And that is particularly problematic, not because of just the massive level of indebtedness these countries are accruing, but because they're becoming indebted to a country which has shown itself so often not to care for the rules-based order on which we all depend, or for fundamental human rights of their religious or cultural minorities. But let's be very careful before we start condemning others for turning a blind eye to Chinese human rights abuses in pursuit of investment, because the UK's hands are far from spotless on this matter, as time and again we pay lip service to Chinese human rights abuses without doing anything which may actually incur any sort of economic cost for ourselves. Nuri Turkle, the Uyghur American lawyer and the Commissioner in the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, has directly challenged countries such as the UK, asking, how do you propose to get China to change without going after the most important thing to the Chinese government, which is their economic interests? And whether the Minister likes it or not, it's an inescapable fact that for so long as we pay little more than lip service to condemning China's human rights, while we continue to trade in goods which we know are at very least highly suspect of being made by Uyghur slave labour, then we really do not have a moral high ground from which to lecture others. Last month, for example, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee secured an adjournment debate on solar supply chains, in which she made it clear that the UK, by lagging behind the US and the European Union in ensuring that Chinese solar panels coming to the UK are not produced by Uyghur slave labour, the UK was in real danger of becoming a dumping ground for what she described as dirty solar. But this isn't a new issue for the government. Just over 2 years ago, I introduced a bill to this House which would have prohibited the products of any goods made by forced labour in the Xinjiang region, and would have required all companies importing products from Xinjiang to the UK to provide proof that their manufacture was not involved in forced or enslaved labour. The bill would have brought the UK into line with the United States, which passed a very similar law in 2021. So there have been opportunities to act, but thus far the UK government have chosen not to. And that's why, Minister, there is a growing perception that this government is just paying lip service to Chinese human rights abuses without doing anything practical or tangible. And I recall a similar debate in 2020 And the UK Government Minister replied to me then that they would continue to urge the Chinese authorities to change their approach in Xinjiang and respect international human rights. But 4 years on, there is no evidence whatsoever that that approach has worked. And it's clear that China has not paid the slightest heed to what the UK government, or indeed anyone else, has to say on their human rights record. But of course, it's not just the Uyghurs whose human rights have been trampled over. Last week, at a surgery on the Isle of Bute, I met with my constituent Mary Clark, who's a Falun Gong practitioner, and she reminded me that it's 5 years since a China tribunal led by Sir Geoffrey Nice found that the Falun Gong practitioners in China were being subjected to the most awful crimes, including the unspeakably horrific practice of organ harvesting, which is truly a crime against humanity. But despite the overwhelming evidence and unambiguous verdict of the tribunal, the response that was demanded of governments and other international actors simply did not follow. Not even after the 2021 report from the UN on the freedom of religion and belief, when they provided clear evidence that such abhorrent practices, did the international community take any action against China. And we are reminded, thankfully, every opportunity from the Honourable Member for Strangford that freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental human right, and we, as part of the international community, have a responsibility to protect it. So in short, we talk a good game, but we never deliver. And decades of harsh condemnation, despite urging and impassioned persuasion, have failed to shift China one iota. And it seems that not even the tearing up of a legally binding international agreement and a slew of broken promises made to the people of Hong Kong can stir the UK into much more than finger-wagging, tut-tutting and head-shaking. The speed at which Beijing has stripped away the basic freedoms of expression, peaceful protest, and has extinguished Hong Kong's independent free press, turning Hong Kong from being one of the most open cities in Asia to one of the most repressive, should alarm every one of us. The use of the draconian national security law to crack down on pro-democracy campaigners, including Jimmy Lai, who's still on trial, is an absolute disgrace, and it's a shame on this country. And if that doesn't motivate the UK to take a more robust attitude to Beijing, then we have to conclude that perhaps nothing will. Of course, we're not naive enough to believe that the UK could stand up to the economic might of China by itself. But sadly, all too often, when presented the opportunity to act in concert with friends and allies, the UK government has chosen not to.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Ms Rees, and it's a pleasure to contribute to this debate under your chairmanship. And I was going to begin the debate by saying I thought I was one of the few members of this House who had lived in China and spoke Mandarin, but I see that people have turned out in great numbers. The member for Bolton North East and, of course, the member for Bermondsey. Many of us teaching English to begin with, myself in Nanjing in the 1990s, but all of us agreeing that Chinese people gave us enormous amounts of hospitality, a warm, friendly experience, and so much pride in a 5,000-year-old civilization with a passion to modernise China and a desire to provide for more and more Chinese people no longer to live in poverty. Now, as the years have gone on, the tone, though, has changed, I think, coming out of the Chinese government. Undoubtedly, 30 years of economic progress has catapulted China to become the world's second largest economy by some measure, and a newly enriched middle class enjoying lives a world away from most Chinese people in the 1980s. However, the more authoritarian and even belligerent look and feel to foreign relations has increasingly turned us to be concerned about the risk to a rules-based international order. In Hong Kong, the rule of law, under which its economy and society flourished for generations, has been worn down, and journalists like Jimmy Lai, who's already been mentioned in the debate today, continue to be detained on politically motivated charges, while hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers have fled for a better life overseas with less repression and more freedoms. I wanted to pay tribute to the cross-party group Hong Kong Watch, of which I am a founder in declaring an interest, but also the well-known campaigner Ben Rogers, who is a great stalwart for that campaign, and I know he enjoys the respect of all members of the House. And of course in Xinjiang, which has been mentioned in the debate, the Uyghur minority subject to brutal repression and horrific human rights abuses, including wholesale attempts to eliminate their culture and religion. And the member for Strangford is quite right to emphasise the importance of freedom of religion or belief in anything that we talk about in foreign policy. In the South China Sea, which I know the member for Isle of Wight has his background in defence, Chinese vessels and aircraft repeatedly test the boundaries of international law, destabilising regional security and threatening some of the world's most important shipping lanes. And of course, the increasing military activity in the Taiwan Straits, particularly in the last 3 years, which is troubling many of us. There's no foreign policy question more fundamental than how the West manages its relationship with China in the years ahead. And it's obvious, as the member for Isle of Wight started with his debate, that that does start with our multilateral approach to that and friends in the US and, of course, in Australia and down in that part of the world. It does go to the question of identity, closed and open societies. And we know that for the UK as a UN Security Council permanent member and a G20 partner, this is particularly the case. And it's a question we must address head-on with seriousness, consistency and rigour. But it's a question that's rightly linked to our wider approach to the Indo-Pacific. We can't have a sustained and serious approach to China without having a wider-ranging British approach to the Indo-Pacific. Without a doubt, the AUKUS relationship with the US and Australia is at the cornerstone of that regional approach, and Labor is, of course, committed to further strengthening our cooperation with the US and Australia in the Indo-Pacific through AUKUS, in particular through the delivery of Pillar 2 of the agreement. We're equally committed to deepening our increasingly close relationships with ASEAN nations through our trade arrangements there, and also Japan and South Korea. We welcome the moves that have been made in this regard over the past few years, but this must be encased within a wider and more sustained strategy towards the region as a whole, including China. Because sadly, for the most of the past 14 years, the UK government's approach has basically been the opposite to what we need, which is stability and predictability. We've lurched 180 degrees from embracing a golden era of bilateral relations, having a pint down the pub with Xi Jinping under the now Foreign Secretary. And indeed, some of the questions as to his financial arrangements just prior to his becoming the Foreign Secretary, which do also bring questions to this debate. This is simply not good enough. China thinks in generational terms, and we require a foreign policy capable of considering the bilateral relationship over a far longer time frame and aiming above all for consistency. Earlier this year, I travelled to Beijing as part of a cross-party delegation and met with senior members of the Chinese leadership, which I was approached to do by the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I made clear that Labor would pursue a more sustainable and coherent relationship. Such a relationship must begin with addressing our concerns over national security and standing up for our principles on human rights, but must also set out avenues for cooperation, both bilaterally and within the multilateral system, and allow our businesses to have the certainty and stability to make long-term investment decisions which they deserve. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been clear that this will be centred around a framework of challenge, compete and cooperate with China, which we will develop through a comprehensive and long overdue audit of the bilateral relationship, which is an element mentioned in the member for Bermondse's speech. But even in advance of that audit, some of the changes we need to see are obvious, and I hope the Minister will have some answers for us today. He will be aware that many times in this House it's been repeatedly raised the threat posed to Hong Kongers, and indeed just this week Amnesty International have brought out a report called "On My Campus, I Am Afraid," and I wonder what the recommendations he will take back to government as a cross-government approach to that will be. In addition to that, we've got a question, excellent question from the member for Glasgow South about whether there's been a back door to access to various projects which could have national security implications through devolved nations. Furthermore, what is the industrial strategy upon which this government is deciding important projects such as the new electric vehicles being sold at Ellesmere Port and Neston, which my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port and Neston, so eloquently spoke of? And he knows his patch so well and stands up not just for his workforce but those businesses and the importance of a vibrant operation in the Northwest, which has our own vehicles, which of course has got international collaboration, but which is not dominated by another party. Could the Minister talk to that important question of an industrial strategy? There are so many challenges here, Ms Rees, but it is in our national interest to have a cohesive and comprehensive approach to our relationship with China, addressing the most complex of countries and relationships in its entirety. The issues at stake go to the heart of our security and prosperity, and we cannot just muddle along as we have been. Labor will have a new approach. We will do our audit. We will be clear-eyed, consistent, and guided above all by the national interest. Thank you, Ms Rees.
I could leave a couple of minutes at the end so that Bob Seeley could wind up. Oh, Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Ms Rees. It's a pleasure to appear under your skilled chairship this afternoon. I'm very grateful indeed to my honourable friend, the member for the Isle of Wight, for securing this debate, and I pay tribute to his advocacy for the people of Hong Kong through the all-party group. He is an expert in the area which we addressed this afternoon, and I particularly wanted to listen to him and respond on behalf of the government to this debate today. He speaks with both knowledge and understanding, Ms Rees. The House always listens to what he says with very great attention and respect, and this afternoon we've seen why from his thoughtful and interesting contribution. He asked me a number of questions, but he started by making clear that the relationship with China was far more complex than the relationship with Russia, and in anything one does with international development, one sees how very true that is. He also spoke about dumping, and as indeed did the member for Ellesmere Port. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments about that. Having left the European Union, the UK does have numerous trade remedy measures in place to protect against practices that have an adverse effect on the UK's prosperity and security. We will always respond vigorously to unfair trading practices wherever they occur by working with the Trade Remedies Authority to protect the UK's interests. And we would encourage UK industry to apply to the Independent Trade Remedies Authority if they have concerns, and we always stand ready to look at any recommendations that the TRA provides. More broadly, Britain has 3 active trade remedy investigations into Chinese products at the moment, and additional 12 reviews of existing measures on Chinese exports. He asked me about genomic research, and if he will allow me, I'd like to think about that and write to him in response to his question. And he also raised the issue of fentanyl. We recognise the importance of the fentanyl issue to the United States, and we do welcome the US-China dialogue on this issue. The honourable gentleman for Ellesmere Port warned of the need for vigilance. He made a number of extremely important comments in that respect. And he also, in response to an intervention by his honourable friend, underlined the difference between the CCP and the Chinese people. And he made some very important points about supply chains. My honourable friend for Bolton North East spoke with profound and detailed knowledge. I wasn't sure whether he is a gamekeeper turned poacher or a poacher turned gamekeeper, but his comments were both informed and extremely interesting. And the honourable gentleman for Glasgow South spoke particularly about exports, education and energy. And he raised a number of interesting thoughts on devolution and dependency, upon which I will, if I may, reflect. My honourable friend for Strangford spoke up, as he always does, for the importance of human rights and he urged that we should not allow economic interests to override our moral obligations. He spoke about the freedom of religious belief, and I will come to that in my remarks, but we're very grateful for what he said. And the Honourable Gentleman for Argyll and Bute raised a number of different aspects to the very wide issues we are discussing. And as I hope to show, his suggestions we are merely paying lip service on these vital issues is simply not correct. Turning finally to the remarks by the Honourable Lady who speaks for the opposition, who I discovered to my humility is another China expert. Her remarks underlined that particular expertise, and I thank her for what she said about Ben Rogers, which I think the House will very widely agree. She chides us for the changes in our stance over the last 14 years as a government, but as the circumstances and facts on the grounds have changed, I would put it to her that so too have our policies and our approach. Now, Ms. Rees, China is a major global actor with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It has an impact on almost every global issue of importance to the UK. Therefore, no significant global problem can be solved without China. We must engage with Beijing on issues affecting all of us. The government recognises this epoch-defining challenge presented by China under the CCP, and our response and approach are based on three key pillars. This House will be familiar with these pillars, but allow me very briefly to set them out to frame my response on the issues that have been raised during this debate. The first is about protecting our national security through key measures. I refer specifically to the National Security and Investment Act and enhanced export controls. Secondly, we have deepened cooperation with our allies and partners, including where China undermines regional peace and stability in the South China Sea, and sanctioning Chinese companies providing dual-use goods to Russia. We join with our allies and partners to call out China's human rights violations. And thirdly, we engage with China where it is in our interest to do so on global challenges like climate and artificial intelligences, such as through the AI Safety Summit. Now, allow me to reflect on some of the specific issues that have been raised in a little more detail. Beginning with national security, which is our top priority in engagement with China. I'm sure honourable members understand that I cannot comment on cases that are before the courts. However, we make our concerns clear. Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary summoned the Chinese ambassador to the Foreign Office. We were unequivocal in setting out that the recent pattern of behaviour directed by China against Britain, including cyber attacks, reports of espionage links, and the issue of bounties, is simply unacceptable. And turning to cyber security, as the House is aware, we've attributed cyber attacks to Chinese actors and imposed sanctions against those who are responsible. The Foreign Secretary has raised this directly with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and the government has ordered the removal of Huawei from the 5G networks. Our wider work to bolster our national security includes establishing the Defending Democracy's Task Force in 2022 and passing the National Security Act in 2023. And Ms. Rees, on human rights, it is of course a matter of great concern that the Chinese people are facing growing restrictions on fundamental freedoms, and the Chinese authorities continue to commit widespread human rights violations. This includes severe constraints on media freedom and freedom of religion or belief, repression of culture and language in Tibet, and systematic violations in Xinjiang. The UK continues to lead international efforts to address China's human rights record. I'll give way very briefly.
I know he's trying to fit a lot in. On the point just before human rights, he talked about the difficult decisions about industry which do affect the national security. Could he talk about what was mentioned in the debate, which was Thames Water, financial involvement, and also the nuclear power plants? Or could he write to the members here to go into more detail if that's more appropriate?
I'm thanking her very much for giving me the option. I'll either come to it or I will write. Ms Rees, by imposing the national security law in 2020, China has stifled opposition in Hong Kong and criminalised dissent. Mr Jimmy Lai and others are being deliberately targeted to silence criticism under the guise of national security. And the new Safeguarding National Security Ordinance will further damage the rights and freedoms enjoyed in the city. We took swift and decisive action, including suspending our extradition treaty indefinitely and extending the arms embargo applied to mainland China since 1989 to include Hong Kong. And we also introduced the British National Overseas Immigration Path, granting over 191,000 visas to date. During her recent visit to mainland China and Hong Kong, my Right Honourable friend, the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, met with Vice Foreign Minister Deng Li in Beijing and Financial Services and Treasury Secretary Christopher Hui in Hong Kong. She made clear the government's deep concerns over the situation in Hong Kong. I would say more if I had more time about Xinjiang, but the point was made, I think, by the Honourable Gentleman for Argyll and Bute, and we consistently raise these human rights concerns with the Chinese authorities at the highest level. I will turn now briefly to the engagement aspect of our approach, since no global issue can be solved without China. As I've mentioned, the Minister for the Indo-Pacific visited China and Hong Kong last month. She encouraged China to use its influence to avert further escalation in the Middle East and urged Russia to end its illegal invasion of Ukraine. The ministers discussed mutual areas of cooperation, including AI safety and trade, and my Right Honourable friend underscored our concerns over China's human rights record and interference in our democratic institutions. She also urged China to lift sanctions on UK parliamentarians and British nationals, something the House has quite rightly been outraged about. In February, my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, met his Chinese counterpart at the Munich Security Conference. He urged China to use its influence on Iran to pressure the Houthis over their actions in the Red Sea. He further stressed that Russia's aggression against Ukraine threatens the rule-based international system, which is designed to keep us all safe. The Foreign Secretary set out, Ms Rees, the UK's position on human rights also, and particularly mentioned Xinjiang and Hong Kong. He also raised the case of British parliamentarians sanctioned by China and reiterated his call for the release of the British national Jimmy Lai. To conclude, I am glad of the opportunity to outline our position today. I thank my honourable friends for their thoughtful contributions and all those who have contributed to the debate in what has been an engaging and wide-ranging and thoughtful discussion. It is clear that the challenges posed by China are both complex and evolving, and we will continue to respond with an approach that both protects our national security, aligns with our allies and partners, and engages with China where it is in the UK's interests to do so. And because time is so short, Ms Rees, and the Honourable Lady who speaks to the opposition asked me specifically about Thames Water and about other Chinese investment, I will, if I may, write to her in detail on that as soon as I can.
Bob Seeley.
And yourself for chairing, Ms Rees. And when the Deputy Foreign Secretary is writing with Thames Water, I'd be grateful if you could actually mention and look into the Isle of Wight ferries, because at one point, if one's talking about the how much China's investment is, bizarrely, one of the offshore companies was paying out to the Chinese Central Bank. So they unfortunately became partial owners. Thank you.
That this House has considered government policy on China, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.